There comes a moment in life, strange, sharp, and uninvited, when the warmth of friendship turns cold, and the faces once lit with approval now look away with unease, even contempt. You ask yourself, what changed? You replay conversations, examine your behavior, and even start to wonder if you did something wrong. But the truth is rarely on the surface. There is a deeper war taking place, a war hidden in silence, a psychological battle that begins when you grow, and others refuse to. When you begin to evolve, internally and spiritually, you unknowingly shake the foundations of the identities others built in your presence, because human relationships are often built on unspoken contracts where each person plays a predictable role, and any change to one side threatens the stability of that silent agreement. And as you rise by confronting your fears, healing from your wounds, or simply speaking truths you once swallowed quietly, those around you who have remained still often feel that shift not as inspiration, but as disruption, because your growth reveals something they've carefully avoided looking at within themselves. They may not say it aloud, they may not even realize it consciously, but deep inside there's a discomfort that begins to brew, a sense that the person they once knew has stepped outside the frame of their expectations. And this is unsettling, not because you have wronged them, but because you have altered the balance of who gets to feel secure in their narrative, and suddenly your presence becomes a reminder that change is possible, that stagnation is a choice, and that authenticity often demands sacrifice. And this stings for those who have grown comfortable in denial or complacency. So instead of celebrating your transformation, they pull away, they question your motives, they whisper doubts, not because you've done something wrong, but because your evolution forces them to confront what they're not doing within themselves, and your courage becomes a mirror they cannot bear to look in. For too long, they might say you've changed in a tone that's meant to sound like a warning rather than a compliment, because in their mind change means betrayal, a departure from the version of you that made them feel safe and unchallenged. And now they must reckon with the unsettling truth that if you can change, then so can they. And if they don't, it's not because they can't, but because they won't. And this internal conflict creates a subtle resentment that grows quietly beneath the surface until it becomes easier to hate you than to face the uncomfortable questions your growth has stirred. And so the war begins not with shouts or accusations, but with distant silence, with withdrawal or a strange coldness in the eyes of someone who once looked at you with warmth. It is not always because you've outgrown them in status or success, but because you've outgrown the emotional agreement that used to hold the relationship together, and they can feel it. And they don't know how to name it, so instead they blame it on you. Your vibe, your energy, your confidence, your words. And slowly you become the villain in a story where your only crime was growing past the limits they placed on you. And while this might hurt deeply, especially if the bond once felt sincere, it is in these moments that you must understand that their reaction is not proof of your failure, but of your movement. And you must remember that growth is not always a celebration. Sometimes it is a severance. Sometimes it comes with loss and misunderstanding, and people you thought would walk beside you forever now see your progress as a threat instead of a triumph. And you cannot slow down your healing for the sake of those who are afraid of what healing might require of them. You cannot become small again to make others comfortable with their own stagnation. And you must walk forward knowing that sometimes evolution demands loneliness, knowing that the weight of who you're becoming will cost you who you used to be and who they needed you to remain. And in accepting this pain without bitterness, you reclaim your power, not in reaction, but in recognition that your journey is valid, even if it leads you away from the familiar and into a future where not everyone is meant to follow. Every human being carries within them a shadow, a hidden reservoir of emotions, desires, and impulses they have either rejected, suppressed, or disowned throughout life, often because society, family, or even their own inner critic convinced them those aspects were unworthy, dangerous, or shameful. And this shadow grows quietly in the depths of the unconscious, shaping thoughts, reactions, and behaviors in subtle but powerful ways, without ever needing to announce itself. And when you begin to live more consciously, when you start showing up in your truth, Without apology, when you embrace parts of yourself that others are still busy denying in themselves, something begins to stir in them that they can't quite name, a kind of unease that isn't about you, but about what you awaken in them, and your authenticity becomes a trigger not because you're wrong or loud or confrontational, but because your mere presence reminds them of the parts they've buried. Your freedom confronts their repression, your light casts shadows in the rooms they've kept locked. Your courage in accepting your flaws and complexities exposes their fear of facing theirs, and while they may not understand this dynamic consciously, the emotion it produces is very real and often manifests as irritation, discomfort, or an unexplainable pull away from you, because the psyche is designed to protect its fragile image of self. And when that image is threatened by another's wholeness, it defends itself the only way it knows how, by projecting the discomfort outward. And so, rather than confronting their own shadow, they project it onto you, and begin to believe it is you who is arrogant, you who is fake, you who thinks you're better or too much, and in doing so they protect the illusion they've carefully built around themselves, and your presence becomes the battleground not because of anything you said or did directly, but because you are now unknowingly at war with the parts of them they refuse to acknowledge, and this is the beginning of a psychological conflict that simmers beneath the surface, a conflict between your self-acceptance and their self-denial, and often this war becomes deeply personal, not because you're the cause, but because you've become the mirror, and mirrors are dangerous things to those who aren't ready to see, and they may try to shatter you with gossip, coldness, exclusion, sarcasm, or passive-aggressive jabs, not out of malice, but out of unconscious defense, because the shadow hates exposure, it fears illumination, and you walking confidently in your truth is the light it cannot bear, and sometimes the more you heal, the more they resist, not because they hate you, but because your healing highlights their wounds. The more you integrate your inner world, the more disintegrated they feel. And rather than ask themselves hard questions, it is easier for them to find reasons to dislike you, to create distance, to pretend the problem is you, when in fact the real problem is the dissonance your truth creates inside them. And you must understand this. If you are to survive such moments with your sanity and spirit intact, you must know that being misunderstood is not always a reflection of miscommunication, but sometimes a sign that you've touched a nerve they aren't ready to face. You must hold compassion for their struggle without shrinking yourself to accommodate their fear. And you must also resist the urge to defend yourself too loudly, because those committed to avoiding their own shadow will only see your defense as proof of guilt. And instead of offering explanations, focus on your path. Stay committed to your inner integration, because their rejection may hurt, but it also signals that your light has become too honest for their comfort, too real for their illusion. And in the silence of their withdrawal, there is a strange confirmation that you are stepping into wholeness, and wholeness often makes the fragmented feel afraid, not because of your wrongness, but because of your alignment. And this is the paradox of healing, that it often divides before it unites, and those who are not yet ready to meet their own darkness will find fault in your light, because facing themselves feels far more painful than resenting you. Envy is one of the most quiet and dangerous emotional poisons, because it rarely shows itself in its true form. It hides behind polite smiles, behind forced compliments, behind sudden silence when you enter a room or when your name is mentioned. It hides in the way people avoid celebrating you too loudly, or in how their congratulations come just a little too late or sound a little too flat. It hides in subtle withdrawal, in the shift of energy that you can't quite explain, but you feel deep in your bones. And what makes envy so destructive is that it begins long before anyone admits they feel it, because most people don't even know it has taken root in them. They confuse it with annoyance or indifference or even criticism, but the truth is that something in your life, something about your peace, your success, your happiness, your inner confidence reminds them of something they wish they had or believed they could never have, and instead of being inspired, they become quietly agitated, because envy doesn't just say, "I want what you have." It often says, "I don't think you deserve it." And that belief starts to eat away at their perception of you, and before long they begin to rewrite the story of who you are, not based on truth, but based on the discomfort your presence causes them, they begin to downplay your effort, to question your intentions, to reinterpret your growth as luck, arrogance, or some kind of mask, and they may do this without any open hostility, but their actions start to speak in other ways. They stop showing up for your milestones. They stop mentioning your name. When they talk about what's possible, they begin to distance themselves, not just physically, but emotionally. They become cold, unbothered, passive, and you are left wondering what changed. And the hardest part is that you can feel it, but can't name it, because envy is a silent fracture. It creates distance without words. It builds resentment without confrontation, and the danger lies in how long it goes unaddressed, because you start to doubt yourself, you start to question whether you did something wrong. You may even feel guilty for shining too brightly, for feeling too good, for achieving what you once only dreamed of. But the truth is that your joy doesn't harm anyone, your growth doesn't take anything away from others, your elevation isn't a threat unless someone has built their worth on comparison. And envy is rooted in deep comparison. It thrives where people measure themselves not by who they are, but by how they stack up next to others. And when they perceive themselves as falling short, rather than rising to meet their potential, they begin to tear down what they can't match. And this is where the silent war begins. They don't attack you directly, because that would require honesty and courage. Instead, they minimize you, they exclude you. They begin to speak in ways that plant doubt in the minds of others, because if they can't rise with you, they would rather see you descend. And often these people were once close to you. They were friends, family, even supporters, which makes the wound sharper, because you believed they were for you until they saw you doing what they told themselves they couldn't. And this isn't your burden to carry, because their envy isn't proof of your wrongdoing, it's a reflection of their inner struggle. And while it's painful to feel the shift, it's vital to remember that the discomfort they feel is not your responsibility to soothe. You cannot shrink to protect the insecurities of others. You cannot apologize for becoming who you were meant to be. And you must learn to see envy not as a judgment of your character, but as a signal that you've stepped into something rare, something powerful, something others are still searching for. And while you should hold compassion, you must not hold back. You must protect your peace not by fighting them, but by continuing forward and understanding that the hatred you feel growing in silence is often the sound of someone else battling themselves and projecting their losses onto your light. When you begin to set boundaries after a lifetime of people-pleasing or emotional compliance, it sends shockwaves through the relationships that were built on your silence, your availability, your endless yes. And it's not because people are evil or consciously manipulative, but because many have grown comfortable with versions of you that served their needs and not your own. And when you finally learn to say no, when you decide not to explain yourself, when you stop sacrificing your mental peace to keep others emotionally comfortable, they don't see it as you protecting your well-being. They interpret it as a threat to the control they once had over you. And control doesn't always look like domination. Sometimes it looks like dependency. Sometimes it looks like the quiet expectation that you'll always agree, always answer the phone, always sacrifice your time, your energy, your sleep, your dreams, so that others don't have to face their own discomfort or take responsibility for their emotional mess. And the moment you disrupt that pattern, the mask begins to fall, not yours, but theirs. And it becomes evident that what they called love was often convenience, what they called closeness was often control. And it is here that the real battle begins, not out loud, not in the form of direct confrontation, but in the subtle art of emotional punishment. You'll feel it in their sudden distance, in the way they stop including you in conversations, in how they talk about you to others, as if your boundaries are evidence of selfishness or arrogance, when in reality they are witnessing the end of an era, the end of your compliance, the end of their silent control over how you move, speak, give, and show up. And instead of honoring your transformation, they resist it. They question your motives. They call you changed, as the change is betrayal and not evolution. And they will try to provoke guilt. They'll remind you of the times you were there for them, as if love is a contract of self-neglect. They'll say you're acting different, but what they really mean is you're no longer easy to manipulate, and that reality threatens the emotional economy they built around you. and while you might feel hurt, even confused, you must understand that your boundaries are not the problem, they are the mirror exposing how one-sided many of your connections have been, and the war that follows is a war of silence, glances, tension, unspoken blame, and passive-aggressive remarks that aim to pull you back into the role you've now outgrown. But this is the cost of stepping into your truth. It is the cost of choosing self-respect over approval. And while they may never admit it openly, the distance they create isn't a rejection of you, it's a resistance to the version of you that no longer bends for their comfort. They don't know how to relate to the version of you that says no, that walks away, that prioritizes self-worth over history, and their anger is not always conscious. Sometimes it's just the natural reaction of someone who realizes their access to your time, energy, and emotional labor has expired, and this withdrawal, this tension, this quiet anger is not something to chase or fix. It is something to witness and understand. It is the clearest sign that your growth has disrupted a dynamic that was never mutual, and while it might be tempting to over-explain, to apologize, to return to the old patterns just to maintain peace, you must remember that peace built on self-abandonment is not peace at all. And your freedom, your inner safety, your sense of self must come first, even if it costs you the relationships that were never built on your full presence in the first place. And though the silence may be loud, though the sudden change in how they treat you might sting, you must stand firm, because boundaries are not walls, they are doors. And when you close the doors to manipulation, guilt, tripping, and emotional dependency, you open the doors to authenticity, mutual respect, and true connection, and the ones who cannot walk through those new doors were never standing with you fully to begin with. This hatred often comes without warning, without confrontation, without any clear moment that could explain the shift, and that's because the war is not external, it's internal, and it doesn't start with words or visible actions, but with subtle emotions brewing beneath the surface, feelings that even the other person may not fully understand. And it begins quietly, perhaps with a moment of jealousy. They don't acknowledge a flash of resentment. They brush aside a sense of being challenged or exposed that they can't quite name, and rather than process these feelings, they let them simmer and grow and mutate into a kind of silent rejection that never gets voiced but starts to manifest in coldness, in delays, in unreturned messages, in energy that feels suddenly off. And what makes this form of hatred so difficult to face is that there is nothing tangible to grasp, no argument to resolve, no betrayal to mend, because it's not about something you did, it's about something you triggered, and you become the symbol of an inner conflict they haven't resolved. You become the living, breathing evidence of everything they are afraid to become or afraid to confront. And since the psyche resists being destabilized, it projects the tension outward. You become the problem, the one who changed, the one who thinks too highly of themselves, the one who left them behind. And all this happens in silence, not because they are choosing to be cruel, but because acknowledging their emotions would require them to look inward. And most people are not taught how to sit with themselves, how to reflect, how to face the parts of them that feel left behind or unworthy, and so they cope in the only way they know how. They distance, they detach, they pretend you don't matter anymore. And the war continues in the silence, in the glances that carry disappointment, in the tone that holds a grudge, in the space that grows between you for reasons that will never be explained. And you might try to fix it, you might reach out or overthink or shrink yourself back into the version of you they once accepted, hoping it will repair what's been lost. But the war doesn't end with your retreat. It only grows, because once you've awakened, you can't unsee what your growth has shown you, and you can't keep folding yourself just to fit back into spaces that no longer hold you. And this is where the greatest test begins, not against them, but against your need to be understood, to be liked, to be accepted by those who are no longer capable of seeing you clearly, because their war is not really about you at all. It is a war between their ego and their soul, a war between who they think they should be and what they fear they never will become, and you are simply standing in the crossfire. And so their silence becomes a weapon, not because they are evil, but because they are wounded. And silence is the armor of the emotionally unprepared. It allows them to retreat without explanation, to punish without accountability, and the only way to survive such a war is not to fight it, but to transcend it, to understand that not every silence is meant to be broken, not every distance is meant to be closed, not every coldness is your fault, and your responsibility is not to win them back, but to continue forward without bitterness, to rise without needing their approval, to grow without needing to justify your direction. And when you do this, you exit the battlefield not by defeating them, but by refusing to be defined by their unresolved emotions, and their silent war loses its power because you are no longer trying to make peace with people who are at war with themselves. And in that strength, in that clarity, you become untouchable, not because you are hard, but because you are healed, and those who cannot meet you in that space will fall away not because you push them, but because they were never willing to walk the path that growth demands, and your journey becomes your proof not of perfection, but of persistence, and in time the silence will speak for itself, revealing not your failure but their fear, and your life will reflect the peace that only comes when you stop trying to win a war that was never yours to begin with. So, if people begin to hate you without cause, don't rush to shrink yourself. Don't dim your light or question your path. Instead, recognize that growth has a cost. Truth has enemies, and evolution makes you foreign to those still clinging to comfort. But do not be afraid of the silent war. It means you are awakening, and when you awaken, those still sleeping will resist, not because you are wrong, but because your existence reminds them that their own awakening is overdue. Walk your path quietly, let their silence be their noise, and remember, hatred that emerges without reason is often the clearest sign that you've outgrown your cage.